مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. رئيس جديد أي سياسة خارجية جديدة، إلا أنه مع الرئيس ترامب جوانب كثيرة من اتجاه أمريكا الجديد في الشؤون الدولية تبقى غير واضحة المعلم. هل سيمزق الرئيس الجديد اتفاق إيران النووي أم سينفذه بشكل أكثر صرامة؟ هل ستقف أمريكا في وش التهديدات المتنامية من كوريا الشمالية والصين وروسيا أم أنها ستنسحب من مواجهة هذه التحديات؟ التنبؤ كما قال الرسول دين الحمقى، ولكن التحليل الحكيم يساعدنا في الإعداد المستقبل. ولتقديم تحليل حكيم حول اتجاه الأحداث الدولية والسياسة الولايات المتحدة تحت إدارة ترامب، يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم الخبيرين وان زراتي ودينيس روس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today we're going to take a look at the year ahead, putting on our prognostication hats to talk about what is likely to be on the foreign policy agenda in 2017. And I could think of no better team than to have both of you to do this. So, President Trump, what are likely to be his top 3 foreign policy priorities? We know what he said about his domestic priorities. What about his foreign policy priorities? Dennis, why don't you lead off?
Well, I would guess that the one thing he's been clear on, I think unmistakably, is ISIS. So I think he will make that a priority. I think the critical question will be, what is the best way to go after ISIS, and does he end up having a team of national security people who recognize the best way to defeat ISIS is, in a sense, not by teaming even indirectly with the Iranians. If you team with the Iranians even indirectly, basically you put yourself in a position where you're not going to have the kind of Sunni support that you need. You want to be able to defeat ISIS, you have to be able to replace ISIS, that means Sunnis. You want to be able to destroy ISIS, you have to be able to discredit ISIS, that means you need the Sunnis to do it because you can't do it. So that's clearly one priority. A second priority will be in trade. I mean, he's been clear that he's going to renegotiate these trade deals, and it's easy to say it, it's going to be a lot harder to do it. But here again, this is something that you will see, I think, early on. The third one, I think, now when I say it, it may be more a case of my wishful thinking, but at least I have one element of evidence to support it. I think there will be some reassurance of allies. Too many questions were opened up during the course of the campaign. Candidates say a lot of things as candidates, but being president is very different than being a candidate. You bear responsibility, and I think some reassurance of allies will be an important part of what he does. You may see that as part of who he sees early on. The fact that even in the transition, he's seen someone like Abe from Japan is a kind of, I think, indicator of it, and particularly because there were comments during the campaign that raised questions about what the approach towards Japan might be. The fact that President Obama, after meeting him, made it clear that he was going to be a strong supporter of NATO commitments, that too may be, I think, an indicator of the future. So I would identify those as his main three priorities.
You had ISIS, trade, and allies.
Right. Yeah.
Juan, what do you think?
I think that's great. I would divide it in two ways, though, Rob. I would say you have the priorities that he has set based on his political commitments during the campaign, and then the realities that face him as he walks in the door after the inauguration into the Oval Office. And so let me just quickly do this, because I think Dennis is right. I think first is he will want to go after ISIS and figure out what an aggressive move looks like. His national security advisor to be, General Flynn, has been an outspoken, very hard-edged counterterrorism warrior, and so that's going to be an area of deep focus for them. I think secondly, rethinking the relationship, for example, with Russia and Iran, and what did those relationships look like, given the mixed signals that they've given as to what's going to happen. But certainly on Iran, this commitment to tear up the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, becomes something he has to contend with because he's promised it politically. And then finally, something that people don't think often about as we think about crises is Mexico. He has put Mexico in the center of his foreign policy, trade, immigration promises. And the very idea that he's going to build a wall, that he may cut off remittances, could bring the Mexican government into some form of crisis, even with a renegotiation of NAFTA, the trade deal in North America. That in and of itself is potentially problematic. And so, in fact, we saw during even the election day, the peso changing value depending on the prospects of a Trump victory. So Mexico becomes an area of focus. Now the reality is when he walks in the door, he's going to have to face real crises that intermesh lots of different issues. Syria among them, because that raises the issues of what's our relationship to Russia? What's our fight against ISIS actually look like on the ground? What is our relationship with the Kurds and the Turks? What does this mean in terms of pushback against Iranian adventurism? So Syria you're going to have to deal with because of all of the externalities it creates. Secondly, North Korea. North Korea is the grand wild card as they march toward nuclear capabilities. And in some estimates of U.S. experts, moving toward actually putting U.S. territory at risk with some of their ballistic missile capabilities as they develop. That raises issues of China, alliances with South Korea and Japan. So that's really thorny. And then ultimately, if you have a moment of crisis, even in the cyber context, because that then begins to raise really hard questions about how you deal with Russia, China, non-state actors that are trying to dislodge or dislocate the U.S. So there is the world that he wants to focus on, and then there's going to be the reality that he faces when he walks into the Oval Office.
Both of you have seen transitions turn into governing right at that moment around inauguration, especially with presidents who come in with largely domestic agendas. And the world intrudes, and sometimes they have their own policies they want to pursue. How much time, how much bandwidth, how much emphasis can a new president with a largely domestic agenda give to wanting to implement even one or two of his big foreign policy priorities, or how much is he reacting from day one? Juan, let me start with you.
I think this is a central challenge for the president and his national security team. How do you deal with the inbox of the crisis of the day, and there are always multiple crises of the day, with the attempts to move strategically with big ideas and big initiatives, and what that balance looks like, and frankly how to mesh the two. And to be able to balance that is a really big trick, and I think that's often the role of his senior staff, the National Security Advisor, to help the president effectuate a long-term vision and strategies while also dealing with the crises that will inevitably occur. I remember the transition from President George W. Bush to President Obama, where the Obama team didn't have the luxury of taking their time on foreign policy or national security, in part because we were involved in two wars, in the war on terror, but specifically because we were dealing with a very real and credible threat, at least we thought, to the inauguration itself. And so in the days leading to the Obama administration taking over, terrorist attack, exactly, out of Somalia, we thought, we were having to work very closely with the incoming team. I worked with John Brennan and Jim Jones, the incoming National Security Advisor and Homeland Security Advisor. The two cabinets were meeting, and in fact, President Obama had prepared a statement in case a terrorist attack would happen that day. Fortunately, it didn't happen. It wasn't real, but we didn't realize it till that morning. But the reality was, as you saw in the faces of the Obama team, they knew that they were responsible from the moment that the president took the oath of office. They would be responsible for the national security of our country, and they had to take ownership of it. And that was a very real moment of transformation toward governance of the Obama team.
Fascinating. Dennis?
You know, it's this distinction of whatever you think as a candidate versus what reality is going to impose on you is a huge, I think, conceptual way to approach this. But I think you also, and this gets back to the heart of your question, so much depends upon the incoming president and the incoming president's own concept of how he is going to operate as a president. If a President Trump is actually going to be chairman of the board and delegate a great deal, that may well affect how he approaches this very question that you're raising. Someone like President Clinton came in, and he had run on a campaign, "It's the economy, stupid." He did not want to be dealing with foreign policy issues. Some intruded on him anyway. He was not going to be a chairman of the board type, although in his first year, he deferred a lot to the people around him because he felt he didn't come in feeling that he knew enough about foreign policy to in a sense, not take into account what the professionals were saying, and he tended to defer to them. With someone like President-elect Trump, one hasn't seen what I would describe as a kind of humility on these questions. I mean, even in many of the interviews he's given, when he says he's going to listen to the generals, but then he says he knows better than the generals. So will he defer? Will he decide that he wants the professionals to be running things? Will he say that because I said I was going to focus on, health care, on immigration, on really core domestic questions, is he going to say, I'm going to do that and I'm going to let them deal with this? Or is in a sense, his own self-image going to lead him into saying, whatever it is, I have to pay more attention to these big questions on foreign policy? These are issues, I think, that will begin to emerge within the first months of his presidency.
Okay, when we come back, I'm going to ask our panelists to think ahead for issues that may or may not happen in 2017 and actually go out on the limb and grade their likelihood in just a moment. Again, our panelists include Juan Zarate. Juan is one of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts. He's the chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network. He's the senior national security analyst for NBC News and a visiting lecturer of law at Harvard Law School. He's highly sought after because of exemplary public service as Deputy Assistant to the President, George W. Bush, and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. Previously, he was the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. Sitting to his right is my colleague, Dennis Ross. Ambassador Ross is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In President Obama's first term, he spent 3 years in the administration, first in the State Department and then at the White House as Senior Director for the Central Region on the National Security Council. Dennis has a quarter-century experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. So far, gentlemen, we've been talking about how a President Trump is likely to act. Let's assume that your view of the president takes its course. How is that likely to act or impact on a series of events around the world? Scale of 1 to 10. What is the likelihood of these sorts of things happening? The upsurge of populism around the world first leads to Marine Le Pen getting elected president of France. Dennis?
Well, I think that's a distinct it's a distinct possibility. When we think about the rise of populism, the appeal of it, what you would even say is the kind of the backlash of the middle class. The sense of the middle class has been left out, neglected, is producing a kind of politics of resentment. And it is yielding what we've seen with the Brexit vote, what you've seen here in the United States. At this point, to suggest that she might not win, I think one would be ignoring the events of the last 18 months.
So a reasonable possibility.
It's a reasonable possibility.
Yes, I think it's a possibility. Sort of make it a middling, a 5 out of 1 to 10 if you're asking for numbers, Rob. I think it raises not just the question of populism, but a question as to whether or not there's a trend toward greater authoritarianism. Putinism Erdogan's reign in Ankara, Duterte in the Philippines, even President Xi's consolidation of power in Beijing, and the rise of not just populism, but in parallel, the move toward authoritarian rule, or rule even in a democratic context that begins to feel authoritarian or move toward authoritarianism. That's something to watch in the context of these elections.
Okay, I see you guys are going to fight against numbers here. I'm going to push it here. All right, the clash between a President Trump pursuing tough talk against China, but yet reluctance to actually engage militarily in new swamps abroad, leads to confrontation in the South China Sea, or not?
I think it's a low chance, actually, for a couple of reasons. I think this is where President Trump's variability, the sort of the untested foreign policy, actually plays to his advantage for a certain period of time. I think major responsible states like China are still trying to understand what President Trump will do with his foreign policy. They are not going to do anything in the first quarter of his tenure to provoke or to cause conflict or to shape the relationship in a way that would create a backlash or some sort of reaction from the Trump administration, in part because I think he's unpredictable. And the unpredictability gives a degree of defense and stability to some of this, at least for a period of time. And so I don't think the Chinese will make any major moves that would cause tension in the South China Sea. At the same time, President Trump has articulated a confrontational vision on the trade side, and perhaps even on the cybersecurity side. So it's not to suggest there isn't going to be some tension or confrontation, but I don't anticipate, at least from the Chinese side, a desire to provoke an untested and frankly uncharted waters with a President Trump.
I think that's true. I agree with that in the near term. But I think if they decide that his approach towards them is too aggressive in the trade area, then I think that they will test him. And they'll probe to see what the nature of the responses are. But I think, again, it's true, unpredictability creates initially caution. But there'll be a tendency to want to probe to see, all right, is this bluster or is it real? And so I think it's one thing to say for the first few months you won't see anything. After the first 6 months of the administration, I'm not so sure you won't see anything.
So if that's the case in China, Dennis, let me ask you about Iran. I mean, even throwing out the idea of ripping up the agreement, the chances of tougher sanctions, tougher enforcement, a new sheriff is in town. Yeah. What is the possibility that we and the Iranians have some real tensions in the near term, whether it's in the agreement or somewhere in the Gulf or some other arena?
I think the potential for that is higher than you see it with the Chinese. In the case of the Iranians, I think they too they're going to watch and see. But part of this, Juan was saying it earlier, and I think he's right, Syria becomes actually the focal point of this. If President Trump does what he says he's going to do, which is to say he's going to support the Russians and Assad, that means he's supporting the Iranians. Now, if you're Iran and basically you're getting more of what you want in the region, you have less of a reason to challenge this president. And when the president-elect says that he's going to tear up the agreement, well, the truth is that he said he was going to tear up the agreement, and he also said he was going to enforce the agreement. I don't know that there'll be a lot of initiative from the administration on this. I think it's going to come more from the Hill. And in the Congress, you're going to see much more of a push to move on sanctions. And the sanctions won't be in the nuclear area. They'll go after them on ballistic missile testing, where they have a right to do so.
Who has a right?
We have a right.
The Congress has a right to tighten sanctions.
Absolutely, because think about the following. Even though the Security Council resolution that replaced the preceding ones softened the language on ballistic missile testing, it went from what was a prohibition to calling on. But the fact is, the Security Council calls on Iran not to carry out these ballistic missile tests for 8 years. And they're doing it anyway. So it's a natural area to strengthen sanctions, and what they're doing in the region is a natural area. The interesting question is whether or not there'll be some tension between the administration and the Congress. We got used to it with Obama because he was trying to protect the agreement. He was worried about being provocative towards Iran. I don't think that President Trump is necessarily concerned about being provocative towards Iran, but again, how does it fit with his agenda on fighting ISIS? If he sees the Russians, the Assad, and the Iranians as his natural partners in terms of fighting ISIS, is he really that interested in provoking them elsewhere? So what I'm highlighting is what is a kind of inherent tension in terms of what the President-elect himself has said. And how he sorts out that tension will tell us a lot about whether or not we'll see an increase in problems or tension and conflict with the Iranians.
Gentlemen, this is a long list for President-elect Trump. So thank you very much for identifying the trouble spots for us. We'll be back to see how he does before too long. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول مستقبل العلاقات بين الولايات المتحدة وروسيا، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.